Hello and welcome. You are watching Global Lens. I'm Parikshit Luthra. The top story this evening. Global markets are on tenterhooks after the US-China trade conflict flares up once again. Stocks edge higher in Europe and the US after President Trump signaled openness to dialogue, claiming it will all be fine. Trump also warned that China's export control on rare earths is a major barrier to talks. The president's comments came days after he announced that tariffs on Chinese imports will be hiked by 100% from November 1st, taking the total tariffs to 130%. He also hinted at curbing exports of any and all critical software and Boeing plane parts. China accused the US of double standards, asserting it is not afraid of a trade war. Trump's fresh tariff salvo followed China's decision to expand export curbs on rare earths and related technologies from the 8th of November. The expanding list now covers 12 out of 17 types of rare earths, lithium-ion battery materials and synthetic diamonds. The latest tensions have alarmed US retail and trade experts who warn that the standoff could lead to more price increases and hurt consumer demand. If Trump goes through with his threat, the levies would come in just as the holiday shopping season starts. Many firms could delay orders or hold shipments in China, disrupting supply chains. President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping could meet on the sidelines of the APEC meeting in South Korea later this month. Experts are hopeful a deal can be reached before the levies kick in. Trump, meanwhile, struck an upbeat note about the prospects for a truce. Listen in.
I think we're going to be fine with China. Look, I have a great relationship with President Xi. He's a very tough man. He's a very smart man. He's a great leader for their country. He's a great leader. And I have a great relationship with him. I think we'll get it set. I know what happened. I really understand what happened. And I'm not even saying he's wrong. But then we met him with something much tougher than what he did to us. Again, because of the tariffs, it's much tougher.
How will the escalation in trade tensions impact global supply chains and markets? Joining us right now is Thierry Wizman of Macquarie Group. Thierry, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Let me begin by asking you, this time the trade war and tensions between US and China seem worse than before. How do you think markets are going to react in the run-up to the November 10 deadline?
It's very interesting that you bring up the November 10th deadline, because I think a lot of people had forgotten about that deadline in the last few months. Remember that there is not just a November 1st deadline, which is the new deadline for the 100% tariffs that were announced on Friday, but there had always been a November 10th deadline for the 145% tariffs that Trump had announced way back in April, which were only put temporarily in remission or on ice until November 10th, on the premise that some sort of agreement would be reached between the US and China between then and now, or between then and November 10th. So there was always a risk to the markets that this deadline would not be met, would not be resolved in time, and that we would have tariffs move much higher, even before the last few weeks of tit-for-tat measures, both tariff and non-tariff measures that the US and China have announced. So right now, I think the markets are going to be hesitant, and I think to really be bulled up or excited here, despite all the good things that might be happening in the US, for example, the AI boom and the AI revolution, there is quite a lot of concern all of a sudden again that the more deleterious effects of higher tariffs will come back. By that, I mean prospectively higher consumer prices. And that is very important at this juncture, because the Federal Reserve is meeting on October 29th in the US. And of course, they are already expressing some concern about the stickiness of inflation. Now, imagine if they meet under the shadow of the prospect that we could see 145% tariffs on China. I think that would give them pause about the need to cut rates again, with all of that uncertainty hanging. So this could have an effect on monetary policy by extension. I don't think we're going to have clarity until we get to November 10th. I think both sides want to negotiate here, and of course, both sides don't want to concede easily to the other. And that means that we may see these negotiations drag on for another 3 weeks, at least.
Right. Deal or no deal, what's going to be the impact on the dollar, according to you?
Well, it's interesting because starting in February, as the market began to anticipate the prospect that the U.S. would put tariffs not just on China but on the rest of the world, the U.S. dollar weakened, and it weakened quite a bit between February and then into the collapse in March and April and May, and even after that, it continued to weaken on the premise that there was a lot of policy uncertainty in the U.S. There was a lot of policy chaos in the U.S., and this was emanating from the the lack of clearness with regard to where tariff policy was going. That certainly was one component. I think now things will be a little bit different. The market has generally accepted that there's a lot of policy uncertainty in the U.S. It has already repriced for that effectively. But more importantly, there are other countries around the world that are expressing or seeing just as much policy uncertainty as the U.S. seemed to have been experiencing back in the spring. We have uncertainty with regard to where France will go with its new government, if it gets one. We have uncertainty about where Japan will go with its new government. We certainly have uncertainty about how the UK is going to address its budgetary issues. And of course, we have this other issue, which is that the market has accepted the idea that the Federal Reserve will be easing aggressively. Now, if this wave of tariffs, if you will, drives up inflation expectations, the Fed may pause. So I think all of these things are marshaling in favor of the view that we will not see a repeat of the collapse of the dollar that we saw last spring, even if we get to a point where we see 145% tariffs on China.
Right. So you're saying that we will not see the collapse of dollar even if we have 145% tariffs. But this time, the kind of export controls that China is imposing, this seems to be very far-reaching to hurt supply chain of consumer goods, of automobiles, certain U.S. vessels as well. Earlier, Donald Trump threatened 100% tariffs. Later on, there was a clampdown, maybe an off-ramp being offered saying that we don't want to hurt China. Don't worry about China. It'll be just fine. A highly respected Xi does not want a depression in his country. Neither do I in my own country. How concerned would you be this time about the impact of export controls that China is looking to impose? It's going to impact everyone, but specifically on U.S. markets and U.S. companies, what's going to be the impact according to you?
Well, the impact could be inflationary, as I had discussed earlier, right? The fact that these are not necessarily tariffs, but measures that affect adversely supply chains, effectively, that's the same effect as tariffs. If you block supply chains, if you block the flow of goods, you create inflation, just as if you impose tariffs on those goods. So from a quantitative perspective, i.e., what does this mean for the direction of inflation in the U.S.? The effect is the same. Inflation should go up, but that's exactly why I mentioned the fact that the Federal Reserve would need to take this into account in its October 29th meeting. As far as whether or not this is going to happen, what I want to mention here is that although President Trump seems to think that the U.S. has the upper hand in these negotiations, because this would hurt China's economy a lot more, let's be very clear here. Export growth in China has continued throughout this year. It has not been hurt that much. One reason is that because China has been able to use so-called trade diversion by using export bases in Thailand and Vietnam and Cambodia to move products to the U.S. So it has not been that much hurt by what has happened so far. And as a result, it's not the case that they are in a disadvantageous negotiating position. The other thing, of course, is that the U.S. has domestic politics and domestic issues to concern itself with. As you mentioned in your lead-up, there is a Christmas buying season. Certainly, Americans don't want to be confronted with higher prices just at the time when they need to go shopping. We have a midterm election in 2026 as well. And as you probably have seen, President Trump's approval ratings in the U.S. are not very good right now. They have been on a slight downward trend of late. And that, of course, could also have an impact on the 2026 election. So just as although President Trump may say that China is at a disadvantage here at the negotiating table, I don't buy it. I think that the U.S. is just at a similar, if not a greater, disadvantageous negotiating position as is China here. And by the way, that's exactly why we may see resolution to this. President Trump can threaten 100% tariffs or 145% tariffs, but of course, if China resists giving him the concessions he wants, say buying more U.S. goods, he may back down. He's the one who might chicken out, in which case we don't go to a trade war, but not because China backed down, but because the U.S. backed down.
Right, that indeed is an important point, that China not necessarily at a disadvantageous position. I'd just like to ask you about how this uncertainty is fueling gold and silver prices, massive moves that we're seeing, something that you've also noted. What do you think will be the trajectory of gold and silver prices? Is the current trajectory that we see even sustainable? And are we likely to see a collapse of this kind of high rates at some point?
Well, let's be very clear here. There is a reason, and it's an important one, why gold has been rallying, and this has not even has that much to do with the U.S. and China. There is quite a lot of geopolitical stresses in the global economy. There is also the view that there is high debt, and that ultimately the various countries that are confronted with high sovereign debt are going to have to monetize away that debt by printing money and creating inflation in the future. That is fueling the gold rally too. And then finally, all of this was really started on the impetus of the central banks around the world who started to buy gold, in part because they did not trust the U.S. to play the role of an honest custodian in view of the political issues that the U.S. and certainly this administration has had with many countries around the world. So there's a lot of facets driving gold that have to do with policy uncertainty in the U.S. and the behavior of the U.S. administration. The other thing that's been fueling gold prices higher, in my view, is that gold is acting as a hedge against the failure of growth to bail out these countries from their debt predicament. The only hope we have globally, of course, for higher productivity and therefore for higher growth is AI and artificial intelligence and all the productivity enhancing benefits that this is going to give our economies. If that doesn't play out as people hope in the next few years, they are compelled to buy gold strictly as a hedge. Because all of the bad things that would happen in view of that, higher inflation, debt defaults, monetization of debts, would prevail on the world. So there's a lot of things driving gold higher. Having said that,
Right.
anything that would disrupt the U.S.-China relationship would be geopolitical in its implications. It could also drive gold higher.
But is it going to continue in the next few weeks, according to you? These kind of prices?
It will certainly continue if we continue to get geopolitical stresses. Like I said, I do believe that there is a possibility that we go see 145% tariffs and we don't see the concessions we need from either side in these U.S.-China negotiations. There's the possibility that central banks around the world continue to view the U.S. not as an honest broker, an honest custodian of their assets, but as one that is more inclined to appropriate the value of those assets, like, for example, what Russia must be thinking or Venezuela must be thinking. That will continue as well. I don't see a U-turn there. I certainly don't see a rush by retail holders of gold to go to their jewelers and try to sell the holdings they have. I think most people understand that there's a lot of stresses around the world economy and that there might ultimately be monetization of those debts. And gold is a good store of value in that context and with that outlook. So, no, I do not expect a sudden reversal. Certainly not even if we get to some agreement between the U.S. and China, because all of those other reasons that I mentioned earlier for gold doing well might continue to do well.
All right, that's an important point. Thank you very much, Thierry Wizman, for joining us and giving your perspective on how U.S. and world markets are likely to react as a result of U.S.-China trade tensions and whether or not we'll have a deal as well. Thanks once again. Moving on, we take a short break, but coming up on the other side, relief and jubilation across Israel and Gaza as hostages start returning home after 2 years of captivity. Hamas claims all living captives have been freed. Israel approves the release of over 1,700 Palestinian prisoners. Details when we come back. Welcome back to Global Lens. This is not just the end of the war in Gaza, this is the end of the age of terror. This was the big statement made by the US president today. Donald Trump was addressing the Israeli parliament after Hamas freed all the 20 remaining living hostages from Gaza. After 2 years of captivity, emotional scenes unfolded as the Israeli hostages reunited with their families at Hostages Square in Tel Aviv. Thousands of people gathered at the square that acted as an encampment for families since Hamas's attack on October 7, 2023. Meanwhile, buses carrying nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners and detainees freed under the U.S. brokered deal, arrived in the West Bank. Joyous Palestinians rushed to embrace them. President Trump received a standing ovation in the Knesset as he declared a new historic dawn for the Middle East. However, two members of Israel's parliament were escorted out after they raised posters calling for the recognition of Palestine. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu heaped praises on Trump, calling him the greatest friend of Israel. He also nominated Trump for the Israel Prize, the country's highest civilian honor. While Trump has claimed that the war is over, a number of issues related to the 20-point peace plan remain unresolved. How exactly the largely destroyed Gaza Strip will be governed following the end of the war, and how Hamas's disarmament and Israel's withdrawal from Gaza would be carried out. Trump is now in Egypt to co-chair a summit on Gaza's future alongside President Fattah al-Sisi. Leaders of more than 20 countries are attending the summit where the Gaza peace deal will be formalized. Netanyahu is not attending, while Hamas is being represented by Qatari and Egyptian mediators.
Mr. Opposition Leader, I said he's a very nice opposition leader. I think, no, he's a nice man. Bibi, he's a nice man. He knows what he's doing, right? No, he's a very nice guy. See, now you can be a little bit nicer, Bibi, because you're not at war anymore, Bibi. But only by embracing the opportunities of this moment can we achieve our goal of ensuring that the horrors of recent years will never happen again. You don't want to have to go through this again.
I have submitted your nomination to be the first non-Israeli recipient of the Israel Prize, Israel's highest award. As to that other prize, just a question of time, you'll get it. But I want you to get the Israel Prize, our highest award, to our greatest friend.
On the show with us is Eylon Levy, former Israeli government spokesperson. Thank you, Eylon, for joining us. Let me begin by asking you, the release of those hostages and those heartwarming visuals on screens, does that really bring closure to the Israeli people after 2 years of a very bitterly fought war?
Yeah, it is a historic day in Israel. In the streets, scenes of euphoria. Israelis are delighted that the last living hostages are finally free. People have been crying, seeing photos of hostages. We have been praying to get out of Gaza, reunited with their families. Some of them are in a very difficult condition. One came back partially blind, but they're reunited with their families. The challenging thing now is that Hamas is not releasing all of the bodies of the hostages it murdered in captivity. 28 hostages were murdered in captivity, and Hamas is holding onto their bodies. Hamas is now claiming it can't find those bodies. The families are saying that's nonsense. They know exactly where the bodies are. They're trying to hold onto them as bargaining chips. And Israel should suspend the implementation of the rest of the agreement until all the hostages are home. And that is an important demand from the hostages' families. They are going to keep up their struggle until all the hostages are home, the living and the dead, because the families of the hostages who were murdered in captivity, they have a right to bury their loved ones, and they deserve to get closure too.
All right. I would like to ask you about the remaining 28 hostages who are presumed dead. Today, the IDF has said that 4 bodies are set to be released. What's going to be the timeline for the release of those 28 missing hostages? This is going to be a difficult operation, according to you. How do you feel this is going to be carried out in the next few weeks?
Hamas needs to free all of the bodies immediately and unconditionally. That is part of the agreement. And the hostage families expect that Hamas is going to pretend that it doesn't know where some of the bodies are. Because Hamas is a cruel and barbarian terrorist organization. Let's remember who we're dealing with. We're dealing with the bloodthirsty terrorist army that abducted people from their beds, that killed them, that took their bodies, that sent back bodies last time in public ceremonies where they invited people to celebrate and sent them back in locked coffins. We know we're dealing with an enemy that is pure evil and that is going to try to hold on to leverage. So there is a part of the agreement, there will be a joint international task force that will help to locate the bodies. But the first thing is Hamas has to give back all of the bodies in its possession, and it's not doing that. That is a violation of the agreement, and it must comply.
Right. I would also like to ask you, what is now the road ahead in terms of bringing peace? Let's begin with what's going to happen in Gaza. How is the situation different this time around? About not allowing Hamas to regroup, about making sure that there is a security perimeter. What's different and what's going to happen now in the next few weeks, according to you, which will be critical for sustained peace in the region?
Yeah, the October 7th war is over. Israel won this war that Hamas and the other Iranian proxy armies declared nearly 2 years ago. But the path for lasting peace is the full implementation of the Trump plan. What does that mean? Hamas must be disarmed, the Gaza Strip must be demilitarized, and the population must be de-radicalized. If that does not happen, then we know that the next war is only a matter of time, and we don't want a next war. Now, Hamas, the first thing it did after the October 7th massacre was to threaten to do it again and again until Israel is destroyed. And Israel is now giving a chance for a diplomatic option to destroy Hamas's tunnels, to destroy Hamas's remaining missiles so that it can never invade again, can never launch barbaric atrocities like it did on October 7th, and can never drag the region into war ever again. So there now needs to be international action together with Israel to dismantle Hamas's tunnels, to demilitarize the Gaza Strip, because we want this to be the last Gaza war.
Right. What do we see in terms of the beginning of the establishment of an interim security force and a political structure for Gaza? At what stage, Eylon, do you think that will begin?
Well, an interim security force is one of the things that President Trump is going to be discussing with world leaders in Sharm el-Sheikh. But it's important that any peacekeeping force actually have teeth, because in West Asia, peacekeeping forces have been useless. Look at Lebanon. UNIFIL, a UN peacekeeping force. Hezbollah, Iran's proxy army, built a huge terrorist army right underneath their noses. So whatever stabilization force is built for the Gaza Strip needs to have real power to challenge Hamas. Because let's make no mistake, the Hamas regime survived this war. Hamas is still in power in half of Gaza. It's launching a brutal crackdown on the opposition and executing people in the streets in Gaza. Part of the deal that Israel is going to stop fighting Hamas is that the international community is going to have to put up a force that is going to disarm Hamas itself. But that needs to happen one way or another. That deal needs to be, President Trump's plan needs to be implemented. Because if it is not, and if Hamas rebuild its military machine, it's going to drag us into another war. And nobody wants that. Hamas is now totally isolated on the world stage. And President Trump's plan now needs to be implemented in full.
You know, Eylon, just to come back to the humanitarian side of it, and we're putting out those pictures from Israel about the release of those hostages. Could you give us a sense of what's been the condition of those hostages, some of the messages that they've released to their family members, their ordeal over the last 2 years?
Yeah, the hostages have been through absolute hell. Many of them haven't seen sunlight in hundreds of days because they were held in underground tunnels. They didn't have light, they didn't have fresh air, they didn't have food. We saw hostages coming back who had lost a lot of weight. One of the hostages, Eylon Levy, has lost sight in his right eye. He's gone blind because 2 years ago, Hamas death squads threw a grenade into a bomb shelter where he was hiding, and he got shrapnel in his eye. He has a long period of recovery. We know of other hostages who were tortured. I mean, they were connected to car batteries and electrocuted. So they're going to have a very long process of physical recovery ahead of them. But Israelis are delighted. At least they are alive. At least they are in the hands of their families. And the long road of physical and emotional recovery begins now.
All right, long road for physical, emotional and mental recovery. And of course, it will take time for that board of peace to be established and a new political structure for Gaza to come up as well. Thanks, Eylon, for joining us here on CNBC TV 18. That's all we have time for here on Global Lens on CNBC TV 18 Prime. Goodbye and thanks for watching.